Welcome everybody to our regular session of our Sierra Club Community Conversations. Tonight we've got a great discussion lined up on organic agriculture as a climate solution, which is extremely timely considering its role in the Global Warming Solutions Act and numerous other discussions in the State House and elsewhere in Vermont. With us tonight are Maddie Kempner and Grace Oedel from the National Organic Farmers Association of Vermont, and especially welcoming Rachel Fussell, who is another member of our Vermont Sierra Club Executive Committee, who's going to lead things off tonight. Just as a word here that everybody's familiar with now, I'm sure that you're familiar with your basic Zoom protocols of remaining mute unless you're actually speaking. That helps a lot. And the way we'll run this tonight is we'll have about 20, 30 minutes of discussion by our guests and then open it for questions. Want to encourage people to enter questions in the chat box as we go if you'd like to, and then we'll work off the chat box to identify people who have comments or questions when the time comes. So welcome everybody, and I'm going to hand it off now to Rachel Fussell. Rachel, to you.
Thanks, Steve. Hello, everyone. Nice to virtually see you. I'm going to make this quick, as I'm Rachel Fussell with the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club, and I'm just here to introduce and facilitate this with Maddie Kempner, NOFA Vermont's Policy Director, and Grace Oedel's Executive Director of NOFA Vermont. And we're here to talk about regenerative agriculture, which is a wonderful topic. And the Northeast, NOFA, which I should say, I'm sorry for the acronym, is the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Vermont. And within that is housed Vermont Organic Farmers, or VOF, which is the certification program of NOFA Vermont. And they support farmers using regenerative practices to build soil organic matter and replace and store carbon in the soil through biologically active and healthy soils. So with that, I will hand it over to Maddie and Grace to explain that more and to chat with you all.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. Thanks so much to the Sierra Club for having this conversation and inviting us to be a part of it. We're really excited to be here. And it's really nice to see all of you. So thanks for joining. As Rachel said, NOFA is the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Vermont. We are actually one of 7 NOFA chapters around the Northeast in all New England states, plus New York. And we are a statewide membership-based organization. Our office is based in Richmond, but we've been, as I'm sure many of you have, working from our homes since March. And our mission as an organization is to promote organic practices to build an economically viable, ecologically sound, and socially just food and farming system here in Vermont. And so those are really the 3 pillars of our mission: economic viability, ecological soundness, ecological resilience, and social justice. We do a lot of different work in the food and farming system, and I will try to keep this brief, but we have a lot of different programs from technical and business services for farmers, our farmer services program, to community food access, to support for direct markets like farmers markets and CSAs and farm stands. We also do a lot of work in farm to school and farm to institution with our partners at Shelburne Farms through Vermont Feed, which stands for Food Education Every Day. And I, as the policy director, along with Grace and a lot of other folks on our team, also do work around policy and advocacy to support our mission. And also, as Rachel mentioned, we house Vermont Organic Farmers, or VOF, which is a USDA accredited organic certification program that certifies, I believe, close to 800 organic farmers and processors around the state at this point. And we have had that certification program since 2003. And I'll let Grace introduce herself and say a little more.
Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Oedel. I'm really pleased to be here tonight, and I thank you for hosting us to bring together these conversations. Our 2 communities are working for a shared vision, which is a resilient Vermont, a Vermont where the planet is viable for our grandchildren, where our scale of agriculture is a sustainable one, where our farmers are valued as ecosystem stewards and we cherish their role in our communities. They have viable livelihoods, and where all eaters have access equitably to quality food. So we want to sort of take a moment to step back and say that the topic of this conversation is called climate change, organic agriculture as a tool in the fight to mitigate and adapt to a changing climate. I think that we see what's happening out west. I'm sitting here right now in Huntington, and I can see the very red skies out the window. I've been reading about how the smoke is coming from the wildfires out west, and I think we're all feeling right now with some real urgency a sense that climate change is happening. It's here. It's affecting folks all across the globe. It has been for years, but it's really coming home in a new way right now, I think, for our culture. And I also believe that COVID has shown us how brittle our food system is, and that our essential workers, farm workers, and farmers are on the front lines. They're undervalued and often not fully appreciated in the ways that they are paid, in the ways that they are held up as community members. And we see that this moment is asking us to take an intersectional view of what agriculture can do for our communities and our world. We know that if we begin to shift the ways we farm and access food, we can solve a lot of both social and environmental justice issues. We can build a more just world, a more verdant world, a world that is resilient and adaptable in the face of a changing climate and ecological decline broadly, if we work at agriculture and our food system. We also know that farmers and people tending land are those first affected by a changing climate, and they are those who are deeply, deeply in conversation with the land all the time. They are the link between the community and the land in many communities, and they keep us all fed. And we really need to center our conversations about climate change really on this topic of food and agriculture. And often we talk about climate change, we talk about energy or transportation, and we're overlooking this extremely basic necessity of how we grow and access our food. So we're really excited to be here tonight and really try to bring our environmental communities and farming communities together in this vision of a thriving, viable, just, and verdant world and food system. So that's what we're excited to talk about tonight. And I'm going to hand it back over to Maddie to share a little bit more about the particulars of how organic agriculture functions and some of the practices that can help us understand how we might be building a more ecologically sound and climate resilient food system.
Thanks, Grace. Yeah, I think, especially in this conversation with the Sierra Club and, all of you who I'm sure have been following closely conversations around the climate crisis, we really see a need as an organization to center agriculture in a new way in the conversation around climate. And we see the need to center agriculture, and particularly organic agriculture, in a more positive light and help folks understand who may, share our concerns about the climate and ecological decline, to share the message that agriculture right now, nationally and globally, is a huge part of what contributes negatively to the climate crisis. But we really see organic agriculture as a clear potential solution to the climate crisis. And we are actively working to understand that, help folks understand that better, and center organic agriculture in climate policy positively. And just to step back from that a little bit, because I'm not sure how familiar folks on this call are with organic agriculture, I'll just give a little bit of background on what organic really means, so that you can have that context as we go into this conversation. So organic, unlike a lot of labels that you might see in the marketplace, is a really clearly and closely regulated set of agricultural standards. It includes things like, livestock producers aren't allowed to use antibiotics or growth hormones in their animals. Livestock must have access to pasture during the grazing season up to, a minimum at a minimum of 120 days here in Vermont. They must be able to exhibit natural behaviors. There's no herbicides like Roundup. There's no synthetic fertilizers allowed or persistent pesticides. Like neonicotinoids that you may have heard of, and GMOs are not allowed in organic production. So, and I will say also beyond that, which I just gave, which is really sort of what we think of as the negative definition of organic, meaning all of the things that are not allowed within organic, we also really think it's important as an organization to talk about the positive definition of organic, meaning the things that farmers are actively required to do positively, which include maintaining or improving the health of the soil over time, protecting biodiversity, fostering the cycling of nutrients, and promoting ecological balance. So organic is really intended beyond just these really, narrow standards that define specifically, neonicotinoids, this class of pesticides is not allowed and GMOs are not allowed. It really is meant to encompass a holistic system that fosters, that cycles nutrients, that relies a lot less on outside inputs than conventional farming methods do, and that protects the overall health of ecosystems, the health of people involved in farming. And so we really feel like this intersection of, the agricultural and environmental communities is so critical because organic farmers have such a key role to play in protecting the health of our ecosystems. And that needs to be something that we're all invested in and educated about. And I will just tag on to that too. When we talk about regenerative agriculture, that's a really exciting and emergent conversation, and also sort of a risky one, because regenerative agriculture is really not well defined in our lexicon right now and in our language. And there are a lot of people and corporations who have very quickly latched onto that language. Like General Mills, for example, loves to use the term regenerative when they're talking about conventional no-till practices that are used on farmland that they have purchased or contracted out across the United States, which really involves the use of a lot of herbicides that are extremely problematic for soil health and water quality and that are not allowed within organic. So when we as an organization think about regenerative, we really want to think about it in terms of these organic standards that I just mentioned being a baseline, and then building beyond that, because the organic standards, they are always evolving, and there is a principle within the organic community of continuous improvement. So the goal is really to always be improving upon the organic standards as we learn new technologies and as we understand more about, for example, the huge mystery that is the soil, that is, all of the microbiology underground that we are still working so hard to understand. So we really want to see organic as a baseline, and then we would love to see regenerative build on that to include things that may not be as thoroughly included in the organic standards as we would like to see them, because the organic standards are a nationally regulated set of standards, and sometimes it can be challenging to make improvements even when we as a community really know they need to be made. So, so that's a lot about the organic standards, but I just want you all to have some baseline understanding of what we're talking about when we actually use the word organic. It is a meaningful word. It is a clear set of standards. It's not a word like natural that can just be thrown onto food packaging to sell you a product. And we, as a regulatory body through VOF, really have experience with that, and we understand how closely it is regulated. And so I'll pass it back to Grace to talk a little bit more about how those principles really help to mitigate climate change and build more resilient ecosystems and communities.
Thanks, Maddie. Well, one of the things we talk about is not just a changing climate, but also ecological decline in general. And one of the things we value about organic practices is that they center biodiversity, they center soil health, they center water cleaning, they center creating ecosystems that are functioning and thriving and whole. And this is an idea around sort of a resilient ecosystem and a resilient food system that has also been very illuminated in the face of COVID. We see that writ large, our communities, our agricultural communities that are local and highly diversified, producing for their communities, are able to pivot quickly. They're able to change exactly how much food that they're producing or how they're producing it or how they're getting it to the eater. So there are dual types of resilience we're talking about. We're talking about ecological resilience through climate change, and we're talking about social resilience. What kinds of farms are we invested in? And what we see is that a national food system that is very reliant on monoculture is not ecologically resilient, but it's also not socially resilient. A large farm that is doing one crop that is dependent on a lot of inputs may or may not be able to quickly pivot and feed its community in the test of an emergency. So I think a lot of these conversations are a lot more clearly illuminated right now because of COVID. That being said, I want to be clear in this conversation that this is not in any way a vilification of farmers or eaters who make particular choices about their life that they are wishing to sustain. And what we have experienced in the organic community is that there's a tendency to talk about good practices and bad practices, or the good food movement, which sort of gestures to bad food or unhealthy food. And what we see is that these are systems issues that need to be solved at the systems level. People are making the best choices that they can given the resources and situations that they are in. And we need to get beyond talking really, really simplistically about good and bad, and try to talk holistically about what we as communities can do to work together towards the shared goal of resilience, which farmers, whether they're certified organic or they're not, largely agree that they want sustainable practices that can be heritable to our grandchildren. And so that's the vision that we are trying to move towards. And so the practices that we want to center in this conversation are really about what are those that will steward the land long-term, be able to fight against climate change and be resilient in the face of change, and will keep our state fed. So we in Vermont are really, really uniquely positioned in a changing climate. And in a world where the national food system is very brittle, what we've seen through COVID is that the Vermont food system is very, very strong. Farmers are able to, are really plugged into their communities. They care. Most of our dairy and milk in the organic system is being sold regionally also. So, you think of a product like Organic Valley, and that seems like a large corporation. It's a cooperatively owned business that sells regionally. So Vermont farmers are actually selling their milk that has been bottled together pretty much in our region. So even with our dairy product, we're seeing a pretty tight regional system happening here. So how can we look at what's going well with that and help lift that up? We see a lot of need to shift towards a more regional food system than what we have right now nationally. To get into some of the more specifics of what we want to highlight from what's happening regionally, we want to see more of the kinds of, let's take dairy practices that are happening with this co-op Organic Valley that I just mentioned. There's a lot of grass-based dairy happening here in the state of Vermont. And grass-based dairy, I saw a call that were about mitigating methane emissions from dairy animals. Do grass-fed cows emit less methane? There are studies that show that grazing animals, grazing ruminants, can sequester carbon in the soil, can mitigate how much carbon actually leaves the animal, and also can help build topsoil. So the way that I think about this is sort of the history of land use. And if you think about ruminant patterns on this land base here in the Americas, we had large ruminants that would move in herds tightly together. They would heavily graze an area and then move to the next area. What that does is it gives the soil a really intense clipping and then deposit of carbon through manure. And then it allows that carbon to go into the soil and become a carbon sponge if they're quickly moved off as a herd. And that is what organic dairy management is requiring, is a grass-based system that treats cows like the ruminants that they are, allows them to move through, and it's better for the soil, and it's healthy for the cows, and the consumers see benefits in quality of the taste and people, the quality of the nutrient in the milk through this system. So this is one of these examples of win-win-win. However, the challenge here for farmers is that it's much more expensive to do this system. It's very challenging. There are a lot of farmers who would happily transition if they could transition, if there were markets to buy. Dairy farmers are very limited in that they have to be picked up by a milk truck. It's not the kind of product that you can just sell directly to a consumer. For the most part, you sell to a company that comes and sends a truck and then bottles together. So the challenge there is growing the demand for organic milk such that more farmers can transition and use these practices, get a higher price point, and have all these benefits. So there's a dance to be done between the supply and the demand side that's there too. So we work on the supply side of things too. But to answer that question about methane emissions, I've sort of gone on about this topic. So I want to be sure that we're getting at the questions. Maddie, did you want to highlight any other practices?
I think you covered it pretty well, honestly. I think that there is also, it's just really exciting to see more education and more understanding among consumers of these principles of, grass-based dairy and beef, and a greater understanding that there is a phrase that a lot of livestock producers in the organic realm, and I think slightly outside of it too, use, which is, it's not the cow, it's the how. And it matters less, whether you eat meat, it matters a lot more how it was raised. And here in Vermont, we have a lot of producers who are really setting an amazing, leading example of how that can be done in an ecologically resilient way, which is really exciting.
I'd just like to really add, because it's a time nationally of a lot of sort of division and finger pointing about, we're right, this other group does not have the right answer. And I will just say our position is that farmers, whether they're using conventional practices or organic practices, are people who care deeply about the landscape, people who want to do right by their communities, people who have many times had their farms in their families for generations. And the challenge here is that the culture is such that it's really hard to get the price point of what the cost of production of milk with the kinds of practices that we're talking about, that will sequester carbon, that will clean soil and regenerate that kind of topsoil that we need. Those take a lot of labor, a lot of moving animals, and most folks are trying their best to steward the land that they have. And so we really need to move beyond, just like in the sort of healthy food world, we need to move beyond talking about personal choices and shift to thinking, how can we do this different as a system? How could we come about this from a different perspective and really think holistically that we all want very shared goals? Again, everyone to be fed, everyone to have a clean planet to inherit, and come at it from a holistic solutions oriented approach. So that's one of the things that we at NOFA push for is some incentive programs. We know that the world we're in right now with really intense market pressure and that this huge value on cheap food doesn't pay farmers a living, sustainable way of making a livelihood, which doesn't allow them always, if they're just experiencing, how am I going to pay my next bill? It doesn't allow them necessarily to have the spaciousness to graze animals in the most intensive way. So one of the things we need to think about is, in this time where we are now, we need to get to a different kind of economy that values our communities, our health, our planet more than profit. And so if we have to get from where we are now to that, we are going to need some investment in programs, public programs, privately funded programs that will provide incentives and support to transition practices. So one conversation we are following closely is a payment for ecosystem services conversation that came up. It's an idea that's being put forward by the legislature, this idea that farmers are ecosystem stewards, doing things like cleaning our water when they're doing best practices, and sequestering carbon out of the air and putting it back in the soil, creating biodiverse landscapes, all the while keeping our landscapes working and keeping our people fed. So what we need to do is try to find ways to compensate for that. If we're not able to pay a higher price for food right now, or shift some subsidy programs to subsidize those practices, we want to see incentive programs like payment for ecosystem services succeed. So that's one of the things that we're pushing on. Maddie does sit on the payment for ecosystem services team. So Maddie, did you want to?
Yeah,
Yes.
I want to give like 5 more minutes if that's okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we're just about wrapped for our portion, but yeah, I'll just tag on to that. You all may be aware, like Grace said, that the state, the legislature actually enacted and created this payment for ecosystem services working group, which did, an initial 5 months of work and then has been approved to reconvene and keep our work going. But we haven't actually started that back up yet, and we haven't gotten approved for funding to do so. But that is an exciting initiative, and it's interesting because a lot of the practices that we are talking about in the payment for ecosystem services working group, and a lot of the outcomes that we are really trying to incentivize and compensate farmers for, in some cases that they're already doing, are practices that organic producers have been using for decades. Things like cover cropping, for example, that, there are a lot of conservation programs out there nationally that pay a certain amount per acre for cover crops. That's a practice that organic farmers have been using, for decades and decades. It's not new, but really a lot of these policy initiatives are sort of catching up with some of these best practices that have been in place, but that have not become the norm because our agricultural policy as a country is so skewed in favor of massive monoculturing of corn and soy, and so dependent on these, on inputs that organic farmers generally don't rely on. So we are exploring a lot of different policy initiatives. The PES working group is something we're excited about. There's also a program called the Farm Agronomic Practices Program that pays for specific conservation practices, including newly rotational grazing, which we think is a great addition. And I think, leading into the 2021 legislative session, I did see a question from Stephen Leslie, hi Stephen, about, the idea of soil health legislation. And I think that's also something we're exploring. Vermont has a lot of irons in the fire, frankly, when it comes to ag and climate policy right now. And I think to the extent that we can educate our legislature and all become engaged in these conversations, we can really help to, educate folks about these intersections of the climate and agricultural movements so that they really become one and the same. And when we work on climate policy, we are really working on ag policy. I also just want to say, I'll share that we have put together, it's a working document, but we have put together a future of ag plan, because one thing that we really see that is needed for the state of Vermont and nationally, frankly, is just a vision for what this resilient ag economy looks like and where we're going, and some real clear direction about these goals that we think are really largely shared across different sectors in Vermont. So we have put out this future of ag plan that includes some kind of short, medium, and long-term steps. We would encourage everyone to check that out, and we can send, maybe Rob can send a link to that or something in the follow-up to this conversation, or we can figure out how to get that out to you all. But I think that vision is really critical, so that we all really do have a shared understanding of the direction that we're going and how we get there.
Thank you. Okay, so anything else? So I don't want to cut you guys off either.
No, I'm excited to get in the questions. I feel like this was kind of rambly because in part it feels like so much of our work is deeply centered at this intersection of people, land, and justice. And it feels like we need to come together so that it's not a farmers versus the environmental community. It's obviously we're all invested in a very shared vision and goal of where we're going. Let's break down any barriers. Let's build all the bridges that we can so that we can be united when we come to the legislature, when we build movements, when we show up for each other in our communities. And it's exciting to have the space to really say that explicitly, because I think it's so felt in our day-to-day work, but it's rare to actually have a moment to bring our communities together.
Agreed.
So.
Thanks, Grace. Steve, did you want to take over the questions?
Okay, great. Well, wow, fabulous discussion so far. We've had a great stream of questions coming in. Keep them coming. Everybody, if you have questions, put them in the chat box, or just say in the chat box that you have a question, and we'll get to you. But we want to start with Stephen Leslie, who's posted a question. Stephen, unmute yourself and
Hi, Steve. Thank you. Sorry, I don't have any video. It's just my computer camera just doesn't seem to want to see me right now. But so yeah, Maddie touched on it a little bit, and thanks so much for having this conversation. And I really loved your introductions. And I've been, as a small farmer here in the state for about 30 years, I've really been thinking a lot about, excuse me, how healthy soil is so intrinsic to our survival, not only through abrupt climate change and ecological degradation that, excuse me, that we're experiencing right now, but also, you know, just that we understand that the last 10,000 years of human existence has owed its existence to soil, and that generally speaking, civilizations have lasted about 500 years before they've degenerated their soils, neither then become empires and conquered other people's resources or have failed. And we've kind of accelerated that process over the last 60 years to where we've degenerated about half of our soils in the United States. So it seems to me that it's really timely at this point that we recognize that healthy soil needs to be recognized by society as basic infrastructure, the same way that we recognize bridges and police departments and fire, not so much police departments these days, but firemen and EMT and all of these kinds of basic services that society provides, electricity, the grid, that healthy soil must be protected. And so therefore, Maddie spoke about the incentives. We need to have this reorienting of incentivizing farmers who are able to produce food, fiber, medicine, fuel, that through either price parity or regional supply management, a whole series of kind of New Deal initiatives that we could put in place to ensure that anybody who can provide from the land, and talking about forestry as well, will be fairly compensated, no matter what the ravages of the unfettered capitalist system are willing to throw to the farmers. So that's kind of a comment, I guess, but really a question of, is it timely now to, in Vermont, with the global climate solutions and other legislation coming up, to really try to press for a healthy soil solutions package that would include just transition for farmers in the state to adopt regenerative practices? Thanks a lot. Sorry for rambling.
Great question. Grace, Maddie?
Thanks for bringing that forward, Stephen, and thanks for all your work around a just transition and healthy soils. It's really critical, and we see and value your work. I think that one of the conversations Maddie and I have been having a lot with our coalition groups and with partners like you is, you know, what is the most strategic next step? And I think soil health legislation really does rise to the top as a good next step for us to champion together. And that's something that we're trying to see what happens this legislative session with the Global Warming Solutions Act and with some of these efforts that have been brought forward to formulate our plan for the start of next session and what is the sort of most strategic thing we can move on. One of the things we are learning about working with our legislature is really trying to give actionable next steps that are building towards a goal. So not, you know, making sure we do things in the right order such that we're getting towards our vision, which is part of why we brought forward this plan that we're using as an internal guide document that I believe Maddie put in the chat, but we can put it in the chat, that provides a vision and then the sort of short, medium, and long-term steps in getting to it. So I think soil health legislation is definitely up there. And I also think the work that you're doing, really bringing forward the just transition movement, which I'll just share with everyone on the call, is an international movement that is about a just transition in agriculture focused on both environmental and social justice, and is really highlighting how issues of injustice plague our food system. And if we can solve those, we also solve a lot of scale, treatment of worker issues, as well as treatment of the earth. So we're interested in centering that movement, because it's a really powerful movement that's being led by many folks who are on the front lines affected by the way our global food system works, first and worst. So Stephen, I think you bring up a lot of good points. And one of the things we did want to say in this call tonight is we don't do any of our work in silos. We do all of our work through partnerships. And so, we are in partnerships with a number of groups who work on different issues in order to champion the kinds of change that we need. So, depending on what the exact policy push for next time will be, we hope to be in coalition with the Sierra Club and work together to make some change there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add too that, like, as I touched on a little bit, the policy landscape when it comes to ag and climate in Vermont is pretty complicated right now. And there are some efforts that are sort of midstream that we are a part of that we want to see continue. So I think that, this fall we will spend some time having conversations, a lot more conversations like this one, and engaging with our constituencies and across constituencies to understand really where the gaps are and what legislative efforts we should be pushing most strategically to fill those and to meet the needs that aren't currently being met. And I think soil health legislation is definitely a possibility on that list.
If I may too, just thinking about actionable items, this has been something I've been thinking about and on your question, Stephen, that missing piece of the global warming climate solutions, before we can really have farmers adopt these 5 principles of soil health, I really think we need to go back to what is this baseline, and we need to create a systematic and universal approach to measuring carbon across the region on different farms, so we can actually start creating baselines and track improvements. Because the most important first step to me is this baseline, because carbon in the soil is notoriously promiscuous. It does not remain in the same location. It is very easily returned to the atmosphere through tilling and other practices. So we need the means to truly measure long-term carbon gains on farms and forestry operations. So once that system is in place, in my opinion, then we can think critically about ecosystem services. What's the benefits to the farmers? How are the farmers playing into that? But to me, at least, when I hear that question of what is the actionable items, what can we be doing in this legislative session, is let's start with measuring carbon in the soil, if that's a measurement that we want to start tracking. So I just wanted to add that in as my main thing I keep thinking about. So.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, Rachel, that we do through the PES working group and elsewhere, we partner with the Gund Institute, who I know has done a lot of work and is working more on measuring soil carbon. And there are a lot of amazing folks around our region who are working on that right now. And we are very tied into those efforts and totally agree that that's a really important first step.
Yeah, PES working group was ecosystem services.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
For ecosystem services working group. Yeah, before I just want to throw out a couple of things. One, some of you might be interested in seeing the recording of one of these conversations we did in July about healthy soils. And I posted the link to our archives page in the chat, so you might want to check that out. The other thing that's worth mentioning is one of the things that Sierra Club was successful at this legislative session, and we'll see how we define success in the next 24 hours, I think, with a possible override vote. But in the Global Warming Solutions Act, one of the subcommittees that was set out is about agriculture and ecosystems. And the idea is to look at things like soil carbon and forest carbon and even food security, which gets a lot to what Grace was talking about earlier, full systems. But before going to others, I know Representative Bartholomew is here, who sits on the Agriculture Committee, and I wonder if he would be interested in weighing in on any of this. Representative Bartholomew.
You've got the experts there, so I don't, but I did want to comment, off the topic about the Global Warming Solutions Act, that the House is voting on the veto override tomorrow. So if you care about it, call your representatives before 2 o'clock tomorrow.
Right, it's on the House agenda tomorrow. Pretty important. I understand that people have been flooded with phone calls tonight, so worth adding your voice to that. So I want to go to Scott with a question. Scott Weathers.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. This has been a really excellent conversation. Really appreciate it, everybody. I guess I'm just curious if NOFA has a stance on regenerative ag standards. If that's something that y'all would be interested in seeing, like a legislature or a government regulatory body consider. Yeah, don't think I have anything else to add to that question.
Yeah, I saw that question, Scott, and I've been thinking about it. I think that, just going back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of, that terminology, I think were that legislation to be proposed, and there have been bills that have been put forward in Vermont, our stance would be really strongly that organic should be the baseline of any regenerative standards, so that it doesn't just incentivize further, conventional no-till practices, which, might be better in some ways in terms of carbon sequestration, but might be a lot worse in terms of water quality and the health of, the biology in the soil. I would say potentially with legislation, obviously the devil is very much always in the details, but as just sort of a baseline going in, we would really want to see organic as the floor for any standard like that.
If I could just add, thanks, Maddie. I mean, I think one thing we think is an exciting possibility is for Vermont to differentiate itself. Vermont's already known as an agricultural state. That's the backbone of our economy. We understand that our farmland, our working landscapes brings tourism, which is the next biggest economic generator here. And, we understand that we have a values-based identity, that people think of Vermont agriculture and they think small scale, they think, appropriate sort of practices and quality. And we really largely are understood to be that way. So how exciting would it be for Vermont to further differentiate with some standards across the state? On the other hand, I mean, I will just say there are places in the world, Denmark has set a goal, and there's a state in India that has set a goal of transitioning to all organic practices. What I will say, as connected back with our earlier point, that this is not about holding up farmers who are organically certified as somehow, doing the good farming practices and there are bad farming practices, because we don't need more sticks without support. We don't need more sticks without carrots for farmers. They have been told to change their practices over the years and do many of the practices that are being practiced on farms that are not certified organic. They've been very clearly told that those were the best practices, and then it shifts. And so what thing we would like to see a really supportive programs that can incentivize farmers to adopt these standards and that will support farmers through these challenging transitions such that they can make these transitions. Farmers want to keep farming, and they want to farm in viable ways for the planet and for their own livelihood. So we want to see it as, yes, regulation for sure. And Maddie and I are pushing that in the State House. We want to see tighter pesticide regulation. We want to see our lake getting cleaned up, and we want to see support for farmers that comes hand in hand with that regulation, so no one is getting left behind, and our farmers can keep farming and our farm workers can be treated fairly while they're doing that farming for our state. We don't think that any of it should happen to the exclusion of other pieces of our mission. So we believe that a just food system, an economically viable food system, and an environmentally sound and ecologically sound food system are all entirely possible. We have all the ingredients. So let's use our legislative team to both regulate and then support the transition to that more regulated state.
Thanks.
Great. Let's see. Next in the chat, I see that Vic Izzo has made a comment. Vic, do you want to make that comment here, or do you want to ask a question, or should we go on? You may be on mute. Well, we can come back. James Maroney's on. James, I see you posted a comment. Do you want to express that to everybody?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Stephen. Maddie was describing organic practices and how good they are, and I believe that they are good. I'm a little perplexed by the growing interest in services, payments for eco services, because those payments are going to go partly, I imagine, to conventional farmers. So I'm wondering, do larger payments go to organic farmers because they are doing more and better ecological services?
Yeah, I saw that question, James, and it's a really good one. And it's actually really central to a lot of the conversations that the working group has been having. And this is actually a really central question, to my understanding, in all conversations or many, PES programs around the nation and the world, which is really this trade-off, right, between what's called additionality, meaning like bang for your buck, like that you put the most money toward the worst actors and you get, the biggest improvements, versus equity, which really recognizes the producers who have been doing these things beforehand and making sure that they are also included and rewarded in this program. And I would say, I think that we having a seat on this PES working group has been a really positive thing. We're given the seat to represent small-scale diversified farming around the state, which we certainly take to include many, if not all, of the organic farms. And in that role, we have really been an advocate for making sure that equity is included in the program that we create. And I will say also that the PS working group is really in early stages of exploring these questions, and we have a long way to go before a program is actually rolled out. But I think in that conversation, NOFA is going to continually be a voice for, I think, what you're suggesting, that we need to be recognizing and rewarding the producers who have been doing this all along, and not, focusing so much on additionality that we leave them out, because I don't feel like that would be an equitable solution. But at the same time, there is definitely going to be a need and a lot of motivation on the part of legislators, policymakers, folks helping to fund this effort, to see that the funding that we are putting into it is making a difference rather than just rewarding those who have already been there. So I think it is going to be some of both, is my hope.
I'll also just add that I think that payment for ecosystem services is one tool that we have to use during this transition towards a more cyclical economy that's more locally scaled, that's less about, getting dollars to corporations that are largely not in our communities. It's a major shift we're talking about. So payment for ecosystem services is but one tool in the toolbox that we're talking about. It's not perfect. And to Stephen Leslie's comment here that we should reward farmers for all ecological services, I think we have a tendency as a culture to look at one metric and to try to isolate one thing and measure it as much as we can. So there's a tendency in this conversation to talk about carbon. How much carbon is being stored in the soil? How much carbon, does X practice take out of the air? That's a really important metric, but it's certainly not the only metric. We are talking about nutrient-dense food, as Stephen mentioned. We're talking about cleaner air. We're talking about biodiversity. These things work as a system. And what we see is that when whole systems are intact, when it's biodiverse, there's many kinds of things being grown, many kind of animals moving through the landscape, and it looks different. It's going to look different in New England than it is going to look in the center of the country than it is going to look in the South. It's appropriate to the land because it's in conversation with what the climate and the land can handle. And so trying to, again, look at one sort of factor about ecological health is ultimately the same kind of thinking as believing that there's one output from a field. And so we want to also trouble that, and we want to get into whole systems. We see from the soil, and we're just beginning to learn about how soil works, and mycelium, which is the mushroom filaments that go through the soil. We have not understood how critical those are to soil health, to plant health, to human health until very recently, and we're only learning more. We can't measure those yet. We don't know how to look at mushroom active is your soil? How bacterially active is your soil? How many kinds of butterflies come through there? How much water is cleaner when it lands in the stream? These are all important questions. What does the food that is produced there, who is it feeding? All of these are things that we want to hold. And so we want to measure carbon, definitely, and we need to. And we also need to remember that we have to look holistically at this to come up with solutions. And it's going to take many, many tools to get there.
Great, thanks so much. We're going to go to Lynn. I think Stephen had added a comment, but I think you covered the comment. We would come back if we need to. But Lynn has mentioned something here about current use and that's another important aspect of this economic question. Lynn.
Hi, I don't see that I can do the video. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, good. No, just we have been working really hard to do our part to clean up Otter Creek. We are an organic farm, not far from James Maroney, downstream a bit, upstream from him. And we put land into the WRE program and have really gotten slammed by taxes in our town this year, going up over $1,000. And so I've been trying to work with the assessors to understand why that happened, and they're not moving on that. We got kicked out of the current use program because our land could no longer be anything other than conservation land for water quality purposes. So it no longer fit in the current use language. And so they were the ones who kicked us out of the program. So what are, it's wonderful to have money to incentivize us, but we also have to look at taxes as an adverse response to this. That rise in taxes. We would, either way, it'd be really great to work with farmers to incentivize it all the way through and be aware that taxes might go up if you do the right thing substantially. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Lynn. That's really helpful to hear directly from you about that. And I know that there's a lot up right now about taxing land and the working landscape that's just being really, it's being hotly debated, and it's really challenging. There's a sort of slogan in organizing that's coming to mind that's about about us, without us is for us. And I think about how can we all get our voices in the room where these decisions are being made so that we can come to, to hear firsthand experience around, we're trying to do what's right for our land and we care deeply for our land, and how do we get that voice heard? We're not against each other. We're working, again, towards the same goal. And that's really tough to hear, Lynn. And I would encourage any farmers, any community members who wish to be more involved in raising our voice to get in touch with Maddie or I. We regularly tap people to come and talk to the Senate and House agricultural committees, and it's a really important thing for our legislators. I'm so glad that John Bartholomew is on tonight. Thank you for joining. And we are lucky to live in Vermont, where the folks making some of these laws, we can reach. If we organize and get folks there, we can get heard. So we really welcome your voice at the table, and you're sharing a really important truth. Thank you.
And Lynn, if I may, is it okay? Lynn, I'm having the same problem. I also own about 70 acres of land, some of which is in forestry, some of which is in pasture for a farmer down the road. And I think if we really focused on current use and RIPs, required agricultural practices, to benefit some of this. For instance, we were actively told not to plant trees in our pasture for silvopasture / agroforestry where cows could be grazing, because we would be kicked out of current use. And if I didn't have that information before I went into that and started planting, we were going to plant like mulberry trees, we'd have been kicked out and would have probably had a negative incentive of probably a $5,000 tax bill. That's 70 acres. So I really think it's something that we need to keep talking about and keep pushing that like these things like current use programs are part of the solution. Like Grace is saying, it needs to be holistic. We need to look at everything and how it all relates to one another. And I would also say, Lynn, reach out to UVM. I have been in conversations with, I believe it's the Carbon Forestry Project, to try to be part of that pilot project to show that what you're doing with water quality, there is research that backs it up, so that we can bring this to the legislator and say current use should be expanded for water quality betterment and carbon sequestration and ecosystem services. But to first do that, we need to, again, I keep saying this, like we need to have that research, that study that shows it, and we can bring it so that we don't enter this continued like, well, we don't have that. But anyways, sorry.
Well, and I'll just add too, in terms of the wetlands conversation, that I know there has been a lot of back and forth about regulating wetlands between, you know, the Agency of Natural Resources and the Agency of Ag over the past year or so. And some of that has resulted in, you know, disincentivizing grazing practices, because if you're, you know, moving cows on a laneway from one pasture to another, there is, you know, in theory, more risk to water quality than if you are confining them in a barn all year round and storing their waste, you know, in a manure pit. So I do think there is, again, just this real need to have farmers' voices more clearly infused into these conversations, so that folks can start to understand the implications of what might feel like small tweaks and what might feel like environmentally protective measures that could actually do more harm than good. And again, why it's so critical for those of us in the farming community to be at the table and to be in these conversations with you know, groups like the Sierra Club, so that we can start to have a shared understanding of these issues.
Great thoughts. Great thoughts. We have a question about pesticides, and I'm not sure I'm going to get your name right. Heracleum. I don't know if you're still on the call. I think you are. Can you, let's see, you're muted right now. If you want to share your question, I'll read your question. It's Vermont, we so far along the path of CO2.
This is Mike. Steve, can you hear me?
Oh, I sure can. Great.
I cannot hear you very well, or anyone, but that's fine. Heracleum, if that's the username that came through, that's me, Mike Bald, and I was posing the pesticide question. And I have shared that with the legislature and several audiences, that pesticide comes with a CO2 footprint with production, transportation, application, and breakdown 4 times along its lifespan. From creation to disintegration, there's a CO2 footprint. And yet that conversation goes nowhere in Vermont. Why is that?
Maddie, can you share about the pesticide coalition you're
But
part of?
NOFA, but just to finish off, NOFA gets, I mean, a ton of credit for its, certainly for its advocacy. So it's not a dart. Please don't take it that way.
Yeah, no, I totally understand where you're coming from, Mike. And I will share, for folks that don't know, I don't need to tell Mike this, but we are a part of an active coalition of organizations and individuals that works on pesticide use reduction in the state. And we've been working together for several years now. And we've been successful insofar as getting neonicotinoids restricted, you know, from being used by homeowners, which is really critical, because we know that homeowners tend to use pesticides with the assumption that, you know, if a little bit is good, more is better, as opposed to, you know, more experienced applicators. However, I would say overall, the goal of our coalition is to also really look holistically at pesticide use and regulation in the state, and set more long-term goals that are not necessarily just on a chemical by chemical basis, because we know that these things are cyclical, and as soon as we get rid of one, the chemical companies will come up with another. So I do think that we really need to expand our movement, and we need to have, again, that long-term vision of where we're going and set targets to get there that really move us away from that cycle of pesticide usage that just moves from, you know, from one chemical to another over time, because that's constant. It's never going to end. The cycle of, you know, capitalism really perpetuates that effectively. So I do think that we need longer term solutions and a real overhaul of our pesticide regulations in the state.
Steve,
Well, this is fabulous.
Oh,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Rachel.
You want to ask one more question? It's almost 8, and I just want to leave room for Rob to leave us with a closing statement.
Right. Well, that's exactly where I was headed. Actually, not even with another question, but I think, it's amazing how many different components there are of this agricultural question. I love Grace's discussion of bringing all the pieces together. But maybe we could go to you folks for some closing thoughts as we come to an end of the evening. Who'd like to go first?
I can
Maddie, Grace, Rachel.
I can start. I would just say, I think it's really important to remember that the change that we are seeking is really systems change. As Grace has done a really good job of highlighting, we really see the issues that are core to our mission as intersecting and interconnected with, issues around climate justice, racial justice, environmental justice. These issues are all one and the same. And something that I have learned in particular in this time of COVID is that we will never be successful in our mission until we are all successful, until we all have the opportunities that we need to be healthy and thriving. I think it's so critical that we recognize these intersections and lean into them instead of feeling like that's not my problem, I don't have time to work on that issue. I really think that principle of interconnectedness is going to be so critical to our success, because what has kept us from success for so long over our nation's entire history is a mentality of divide and conquer, where divisions between us are pointed out and used as leverage to keep folks in power. And so I really think that principle is critical. I am trying to really hold that in mind with everything I do. And it is true from an ecological perspective, as folks who have studied ecology know, and it is true from a community perspective. And so I want to share that's where we're coming from. And I want to invite everybody to get involved with NOFA. Please, join our mailing list, join as a member if you can. Please get engaged with our policy efforts, which we hope will more and more intersect with Sierra Club and other environmental and conservation minded groups. And beyond systems change, I don't like to paint solutions as, solely on individual people, because I think that can lead to a lot of despair and feeling like you can never do enough to fight climate change on your own. But I will say, consumer demand does have power. And the more that folks make, for example, food choices as you can that support your values, we encourage you to do that. And one way to do it is look for the VOF logo that tells you, what food is local and organic, so that you can support your values with your purchasing. But systems change is really critical as well. So please try to get engaged on that level. And also make sure you have a plan to vote. I'm sure everyone does, but the election is nigh. That's all.
Grace.
I just want to offer gratitude for everyone taking the time to show up tonight. I feel heartened seeing all of your faces and knowing that we're all in this together. And I used to farm in Massachusetts, and friends of friends are staying there who had to leave California right now on our farm there, where we used to farm in California. We just lost our house to wildfire, and I'm ready to build a farming community here that can welcome people who need to come here based on climate migration, and that will be stronger at fighting climate change through our practices. I'm feeling this very personally this week, and I feel really heartened, equally heartened. My grief about that and my love for the world are in equal measure. And when I see all of your faces, I feel like we are going to figure out solutions that are durable because they're built on our relationships and our community, and we're going to do it together. And when we do that, we can welcome more folks here. We can build a more thriving and sustainable way that we're growing our food and nourishing each other. So I'm really pleased to be here. I appreciate everyone taking the time in the middle of a busy work week when we all have so much on our plate, and your showing up means a lot. So thanks for being part of this movement.
And certainly you too. Rachel, to you.
Oh,
Closing words from Rachel?
I'll just move it along to Rob. He can give us some updates
Okay.
on the next community conversation. But
Okay, great. Rob.
Yes. So thank you all for this wonderful conversation. Actually, as somebody who used to work in agriculture years, now 6+ years ago, that's a topic I know quite well, and I'm glad to hear all the questions and all the progress that's being made for these dialogue. But I just want to remind everybody is agriculture is one of the solutions. Another solution is actually forests, protecting our forests, and particularly, so next week we have a conversation, forest carbon and achieving Vermont's climate goals, and that's with Professor Bill Keaton of UVM, a renowned expert on the topic of forest carbon sequestration. Then the following week is part of National Drive Electric Week. We're doing what we call Vermont EV Stories and virtual community conversation. We are soliciting stories from our membership who drive EVs, because we found that people who drive EVs are the best ambassadors into people looking into purchasing them. Please join that conversation too. As well, we do these conversations almost every week, practically every Wednesday at 7 p.m. You can visit our website at sierraclub.org/Vermont. And on there, there'll be a calendar of events and then also the conversation recordings of every one of these. This particular recording will be loaded up on Monday. Normally I would get it up on a Thursday, but I am taking off myself tomorrow. So it will be up on Monday, and please share it with other people who missed this conversation. So thank you all for the wonderful conversation. Nice to hear from you, Grace. Thank you, Rachel, for facilitating. And thank you, Maddie. It's a pleasure working with you in the past when we actually worked on the GMO labeling campaign. So thank you all, and have a good night.